The Ghost appeared in August 1945. He stumbled into Allied lines near Kanchanaburi, barefoot, skin stretched over bone, eyes hollow from years without rest. In English, he said he was in the U.S. Navy, then spoke about USS Houston. The guards didn't laugh, but they didn't believe him either. Houston had been torn apart by Japanese hands 3 years earlier in the Sunda Strait. Officially, all hands were lost. The stranger spun a story of 2 cruisers charging a whole invasion fleet, Japanese transports erupting in the dark, a general flung into burning water. It sounded like madness. But he had details no outsider could know. Piece by brutal piece, his insane ramblings unveiled a humiliating secret the Japanese had tried to drown beneath the sea. February 28, 1942. Java. The last Allied stronghold in the East Indies was on the verge of collapse. 2 weeks had passed since Singapore fell. The impregnable fortress had surrendered to the Japanese on February 14th, taking with it 85,000 Allied troops and any hope of stopping the Japanese advance. Now, Field Marshal Lord Wavell's multinational command was dissolving like sugar in water. British, American, Dutch, and Australian forces, what was left of them, were abandoning any pretense of coordinated defense. The Japanese were executing a lethal pincer movement. From the east and west, invasion fleets churned through tropical waters toward Java. Aircraft carriers, battleships, heavy cruisers, and dozens of destroyers escorted transport ships packed with veteran troops. The Imperial Japanese Navy had swept aside every Allied naval force that dared challenge them. In Batavia's harbor, 2 battered cruisers prepared for an impossible run. USS Houston and HMAS Perth, the last major Allied warships still afloat in the Java Sea. Houston was a wreck. Her No. 3 turret hung useless, its gunhouse intact, but the handling rooms below, nothing but a blackened cavity from a Japanese bomb. Her hoses leaked and her pipes stripped. Shattered glass crunched underfoot in passageways that reeked of smoke and oil. The crew hadn't slept in 30 hours and hadn't changed their clothes in 3 days. Perth wasn't much better. The Australian light cruiser had maybe 300 tons of fuel, half its capacity. Ammunition was critically low, 20 rounds per gun. The Dutch had offered nothing from their shore installations. They were too busy destroying their own facilities to deny them to the Japanese. Their orders were simple: run, get to Australia, save what could be saved. The man who would have to perform this miracle was Captain Hector Waller of Perth. Hard over Heck, his men called him. The Fighting Fool was the nickname those not so keen on his methods gave him after watching him maneuver his cruiser like a destroyer, charging straight at enemies twice his size. The stocky, broad-shouldered, pipe-smoking Waller had fought from the war's first day. Mediterranean, Atlantic, Indian Ocean. He'd seen more combat than any other Allied captain still breathing. Waller studied the charts with Perth's navigator. Sunda Strait. The narrow passage between Java and Sumatra was 60 miles wide. It might as well have been 1,000. Japanese submarines would be watching. Aircraft would patrol at dawn. But Dutch reconnaissance reported the strait clear. They could make it in darkness, refuel a Gillette Jop, then sprint for Australia. There was a way out of this mess. The captains had one shot: thread the needle, punch through whatever light forces might be patrolling, and escape before the Japanese Navy crushed Java completely. What Waller didn't know, what no Allied commander knew, was that the Japanese Western Attack Force had already arrived. 56 transport ships were at that moment placing the 16th Army into Bantam Bay, directly along their escape route. 4 heavy cruisers prowled nearby. Destroyers swarmed like sharks. It was an unintended but lethal trap. The Japanese war machine had become unstoppable. In 3 months, they had conquered half the Pacific. Rear Admiral Takeo Kurita stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching the Western Attack Force execute its fatal choreography. 56 transport ships, an armada that stretched to the horizon, methodically disgorged men and machines into Bantam Bay. Landing craft shuttled between ships and shore like worker ants. Tanks, artillery, trucks, and 30,000 soldiers of Lieutenant General Hitoshi Inamura's 16th Army poured onto Java's beaches. The force protecting this invasion defied imagination. 4 heavy cruisers of Cruiser Division 7, Kumano, Suzuya, Mogami, and Mikuma, each displaced over 13,000 tons. Their 8-inch guns could punch through armor at 20,000 yards. The carrier Ryujo lurked offshore, her aircraft ready to savage any Allied ships foolish enough to appear. 3 more light cruisers and 10 destroyers rounded out the fleet. But the real threats were invisible. Every Japanese warship bristled with Type 93 long-lance torpedoes, oxygen-powered projectiles that could race through the water at 49 knots for 20,000 yards. No Allied torpedo came remotely close to such capabilities. In night battles, they were decisive. Japanese crews had trained relentlessly in darkness, perfecting their tactics. The Imperial Navy now owned these waters. They'd smashed the American fleet at Pearl Harbor, sunk the British Prince of Wales and Repulse off Malaya, and obliterated the multinational American, British, Dutch, Australian fleet just yesterday in the Java Sea. The Allies were now reduced to a few scattered destroyers, maybe a damaged cruiser or two. Nothing that could threaten this massive operation. But numbers gave way to overconfidence. Admiral Hara, commanding the close escort, had positioned his destroyers to catch Allied ships trying to escape eastward through the Java Sea. Only the ancient destroyer Fubuki, Japan's oldest tin can, patrolled the western approaches. One ship was watching the back door, while the entire invasion force focused on unloading. The transport crews worked frantically. Ships were most vulnerable now, anchored and helpless, their holds open, troops and equipment half ashore. A single enemy cruiser appearing among the transports could cause catastrophe. But the Japanese commanders dismissed such concerns. Intelligence reported the last Allied heavy ships fleeing eastward. Admiral Dorman's fleet was destroyed. Singapore had fallen. The enemy was beaten, scattered, and demoralized. No one would dare attack such an overwhelming force. At 10:50 p.m., destroyer Fubuki's lookouts spotted 2 shapes moving through the darkness. Large ships, running without lights, approaching from the direction of Batavia. The destroyer's captain studied them through binoculars. Warships, certainly. But whose? The silhouettes seemed familiar, one larger than the other, moving fast, with purpose. Fubuki turned to shadow them, her ancient engines straining to keep pace. Her radio operator prepared to send the alert, quote, 2 unidentified ships entering the bay. The omen started before they even left port. In Perth's wardroom, the portrait of the Duchess of Kent, who had christened the ship in 1939, crashed to the deck. The glass shattered across her face. Sailors exchanged glances. Bad luck. Red Lead, Perth's orange tabby mascot, tried to abandon ship 3 times as they refueled at Batavia. Each time, cursing sailors dragged the cat back aboard. He knew something they were trying not to think about. On Houston, the Chinese cook they called Buddha had been acting strange all day. The normally cheerful Ah Fong moved through the galley like a ghost, barely speaking. When asked what was wrong, he just shook his head and returned to his duties. At 6:30 a.m., both ships cleared the harbor. Captain Waller's voice crackled over Perth's intercom, quote, "We're sailing for Jalap via Sunda Strait. Air reconnaissance reports the strait is free of enemy shipping. However, a large enemy convoy is reported 50 miles northeast of Batavia, moving east." Away from them, 50 miles of clear water between them and escape. The exhausted crews wanted to believe it. Houston's men stumbled through their duties like zombies. Still, the report of clear waters ahead put some of the crew at ease. Lieutenant Commander Richard Gingras remembered thinking, quote, "You know, I had no hope that we would ever get away from all this, but now I think we've got it made." But Lieutenant Thomas Payne had seen something else. Hours earlier, flying reconnaissance in his float plane, he spotted a Japanese cruiser near their escape route. He'd reported it. Nothing came back. In the chaos of dissolving commands and fleeing ships, his warning vanished into the void. The moon rose full and bright, another bad sign for ships trying to slip through enemy waters. The tropical night offered no concealment. Both cruisers cranked up to 28 knots, racing towards Sunda Strait. On Perth's bridge, Captain Waller did something extraordinary. He lay down on the deck, then told the officer of the watch, quote, "Kick me if anything happens." Then he pulled his pipe from his mouth and instantly fell asleep. That was hard over heck, cool as ice when everyone else was sweating bullets. His calm radiated through the bridge. If the old man could sleep, Maybe they really would make it. The ships tore through the night, every man scanning the horizon. At 10:50 p.m., they approached Bantam Bay. St. Nicholas Point was 5 miles ahead, the gateway to Sunda Strait and freedom. At 11:06 p.m., Perth's lookout said, quote, "Ship, sir. Baron Green, 05. Waller was on his feet before the lookout finished speaking. The shape materialized out of darkness, a destroyer knifing through the water directly toward them. For a heartbeat, Waller hoped it might be Dutch or American. Then the destroyer answered Perth's challenge with 2 green lights. Wrong signal. Jap destroyer. Waller's voice cut through the night, ordering to sound the rattles and for the forward turrets to open fire. The alarm bell screamed. Perth erupted into controlled chaos as 682 men raced to battle stations. Waller stood rock steady on the bridge, pipe clenched in his teeth, watching the destroyer heel away, making smoke. Then he saw them. Ships. Everywhere. Dark shapes against the moonlit water. 10, 20, more. An entire invasion fleet spread across Bantam Bay like a steel carpet. Transports, cruisers, destroyers. Someone whispered, quote, "They're all around us." Waller had 2 choices. Turn back into the trap at the Java Sea, where more Japanese ships waited, or punch through this armada to reach Sunda Strait. No choice at all, quote, "Full ahead. We're going through. Drive it like you stole it." Perth's guns roared. Houston followed, her remaining turrets swiveling to find targets. Star shells burst overhead, turning night into a hellish seascape. In the ghostly light, the full scope of their predicament became clear. They'd stumbled into the main Japanese invasion force. Dozens of ships, hundreds of guns. Waller told the gunners, quote, "Pick your own targets." While Houston's captain had to coordinate his heavy guns through central control, Waller gave his crew what they needed most: freedom to fight. Local control. Perth became a buzzsaw, spitting shells in every direction. Waller played his ship like a racing driver, weaving between torpedo spreads, chasing salvos, turning toward the last shell splashes because lightning rarely struck twice. The Japanese couldn't believe it. A light cruiser dancing through their formation like she owned the ocean. Waller said to his paymaster, quote, "Rather have this than 1,000 bombing attacks. At least here he could fight back, not sit helplessly while planes rained destruction upon them." But the math was impossible. 9 destroyers were converging on them. Heavy cruisers moved into position. Torpedo boats darted like mosquitoes, and Perth's ammunition dwindled with every salvo. At 11:49 p.m., the first torpedo hit. The explosion lifted Perth bodily from the water. Men flew across compartments. In the forward engine room, a blast ruptured steam lines. Superheated vapor at 500 degrees filled the space. Perth staggered, losing speed. More torpedoes coming. More shells. The Japanese had found the range. Waller knew his ship was lost. But maybe, he could buy Houston time to escape. Waller looked at his bridge crew, men who'd followed him through hell, who trusted him absolutely. He said the only thing left to say, quote, "Abandon ship." On Perth's forward guns, crews grabbed practice bricks, solid projectiles meant for training, and rammed them down the barrels. No explosive power, just chunks of metal fired in desperation. When those ran out, they loaded star shells. When those were gone, someone screamed, quote, "Use anything." A gunner's mate spotted wooden potato crates. Absurd. Insane. But Perth's guns kept firing, spitting whatever they could find at the circling wolves. Japanese destroyers attacked in threes, coordinated like pack hunters. They'd dart in, launch torpedoes, and wheel away. From another quarter, more would strike. Houston's gunners spun their turrets until the mechanism screamed, trying to track targets that came from every point of the compass. Houston's log recorded a brutal understatement, quote, "Fight developed into a melee." The range was no greater than 5,000 yards, point blank for naval combat. Then the Japanese made their fatal error. At 11:57 p.m., heavy cruiser Mogami launched 6 long-lance torpedoes at 10,000 yards. They missed Houston and kept going, straight into their own transport fleet. The 8,160-ton Ryujo Maru, General Inamura's headquarters ship, took one amidships. The explosion catapulted the general and his entire staff into the bay. More torpedoes found targets. Japanese transports erupted in flames. Tanks and trucks tumbled into the water as ships capsized. Drowning soldiers screamed in the darkness. 3 transports and a minesweeper sunk by their own navy in a humiliating debacle. But Perth was beyond salvation. 3 torpedoes had torn her apart. In the forward engine room, the metal deck grates glowed red, then white, then melted. 3 sailors standing on them plunged into the inferno below. Below decks, torpedo mechanic Ian Smith heard the abandoned ship order. He could have run. Instead, he stayed, moving methodically from depth charge to depth charge, pulling primers. If those charges detonated when Perth sank, it would be the end of every man in the water. Smith saved dozens of lives. On Houston, Captain Rooks knew the end had come. His ship listed heavily, down by the bow. Japanese shells had found the range. A salvo smashed into turret 2, just as powder bags were exposed. The flash incinerated the gun crew. Rooks gave the order to abandon ship. He shook hands with his officers, wished them luck, started down the ladder from the signal bridge. A shell burst. Shrapnel tore through him. Ensign Smith cradled his captain, his blood pooled on the deck. Rooks was gone. Buddha, the Chinese cook, found them. He gathered Rooks' body in his arms, rocking back and forth. Officers tried to convince him to leave. Buddha said simply, quote, "Captain die. Houston die. Buddha die too." He was still holding Rooks when Houston rolled. Perth went first. At 12:25 a.m. on March 1st, she turned turtle. Her battle ensign, the Australian flag, still flew as she slipped under. Oil and debris marked her grave. Houston lasted 8 more minutes. Japanese searchlights held her in their glare as she settled lower. Machine guns raked her decks. But something remarkable happened. A breeze caught her colors. The American flag snapped taut, defiant, as Houston began her final plunge. Lieutenant Winslow watched from the water, quote, "With a tired shudder, she vanished beneath the sea." 2 proud ships were gone, but they'd taken half the invasion fleet with them. 800 men thrashed in oil-slicked water. Fuel coated everything, clogging nostrils, sealing eyes shut, turning the survivors into black specters, barely human. Japanese searchlights swept across them like the eyes of predators. Then came the explosions. Torpedoes still detonated against burning ships. Each blast sent shockwaves through the water. Men close to the explosions simply disappeared. Otto Schwartz, Houston's chief boatswain's mate, had survived 15 hours when he heard the engines. A Japanese torpedo boat prowled through the floating survivors. Machine guns chattered. Screams cut short. They were executing men in the water. The boat turned toward Schwartz. There was no escape. He made an air pocket with his life jacket collar, pressed his face into it, and went limp. The searchlight found him. Voices in Japanese. A rifle barrel prodded his ribs, testing. Schwartz didn't breathe, didn't twitch. The longest seconds of his life passed before the boat backed away. Not all Japanese showed such cruelty. A destroyer approached Australian survivors, clinging to a float. Ropes dropped down. Seaman H.K. Gosden looked up at the sailors beckoning them aboard. An Australian snarled, quote, "You know where to stick it, mug. We'd rather drown." The destroyer departed, leaving them to their fate. In the darkness, a stranger drama unfolded. Japanese soldiers from the sunken transports also struggled in the water. When they tried to climb onto Allied rafts, fights erupted. An oil-covered Japanese grabbed Gosden's legs, pleading in broken English. Gosden planted his boot in the man's face and kicked him away. On a Houston raft, Commander George Rentz made a difficult choice. The 59-year-old chaplain saw his raft sinking under too much weight. Twice he tried to slip away. Twice his men pulled him back. Finally, Rentz looked at the young sailors around him and said, quote, "You men are young, with your lives ahead of you. I'm old, and have had my fun." He said a prayer, removed his life jacket, and swam into the darkness. The extra buoyancy saved the men on his raft. Rentz was never seen again. The strangest survivor was General Inamura himself. The commander of the invasion force spent 20 minutes clinging to wreckage before a boat found him. Soaked and exhausted, he collapsed on Bantam Beach. His aide tried to lighten the moment, quote, "Congratulations on the successful landing, sir." When a Navy officer approached to apologize for the friendly fire fiasco, Inamura's staff intercepted him. They decided it was better to let the Houston take the credit. The general didn't need to know. Dawn came slowly. Bodies in oil covered miles of ocean. Of the 1,743 men aboard Houston and Perth, only 696 still lived. They vanished without a trace. In Washington and Canberra, staff officers updated their charts. USS Houston and HMAS Perth presumed lost with all hands. No distress signals, no survivors reported. Just 2 more ships, swallowed by the vast Pacific night. The families received telegrams with practiced military efficiency, quote, "The Navy Department deeply regrets to inform you." Missing in action. That cruel phrase that offered neither closure nor hope. Mothers hung gold stars in windows. Wives became widows without bodies to bury. Children grew up with only photographs of their fathers. People in Houston, Texas, erupted with rage at the tragedy and loss. The city launched a recruitment campaign that bordered on religious fervor. "Avenge the Houston" became the battle cry. An 80-foot replica of the cruiser rose downtown. On Memorial Day, 1942, 1,400 men took their oaths in a mass enlistment. Houston would have her revenge. They couldn't know that on Java's beaches, oil-blackened men were crawling through the surf. Lieutenant J.G. Rogers of Houston spent 18 hours in the water before reaching shore. Javanese villagers found him and other survivors, loaded them onto ox carts, and took them to the local jail. Safety, Rogers thought. Temporary refuge until Allied forces regained control. But the Japanese arrived the next morning. The first impression was not so bad. The Japanese soldiers yelled, quote, "Oh, Americans. Baseball. Babe Ruth." That moment of humanity lasted exactly as long as it took to count prisoners. The Japanese had lost ships, men, and face. Someone would pay. When soldiers discovered Otto Schwartz's group came from Houston, their demeanor changed. These were the men who'd sunk Japanese transports. The horses meant to pull supply carts had drowned with the transports. The prisoners would take their place. For 4 days, Schwartz and others had leather harnesses cut into their shoulders. They pulled Japanese carts loaded with ammunition and supplies. When the relentless tropical sun caused men to stumble, rifle butts and bayonets provided encouragement. When they collapsed, they were left by the roadside. That was just the beginning. The survivors disappeared into the Japanese prison system, a network of camps stretching from Java to Burma to Japan itself. Changi, bicycle camp, the Burma Railway, names that would become synonymous with starvation, disease, and death. They built the railway through the Thai jungles. 1 man fell for every railroad tie laid. They worked in Japanese coal mines and shipyards. They survived on rice crawling with maggots, vegetables stolen from guards' gardens, rats when they could catch them. Tropical ulcers and dysentery turned strong men into skeletons. The outside world knew nothing. The Japanese reported no survivors from the sunken cruisers. The Red Cross had no records. For 3.5 years, Houston and Perth's men fell from existence. Back home, some families refused to accept the official story. Edith Rooks, the captain's widow, wrote letter after letter to the Navy Department. Other wives formed support groups, sharing rumors, trading hope. A sailor's mother in Texas swore she could feel her son was alive. A wife in Sydney kept her husband's dinner plate set every night. They were right to hope. But each day, the list of survivors grew thinner. As war reached its final phase, on a sweltering day, a lone skeletal figure in rags stumbled into Allied lines in Thailand. He claimed to be from USS Houston, a ship lost with all hands 3 years earlier. Intelligence officers didn't believe him until he started naming shipmates, describing the battle, revealing what no Japanese propaganda had ever admitted. Houston and Perth hadn't just sunk, they'd torn the guts out of a Japanese invasion fleet. When the news broke, it electrified the home front. These warriors had charged into impossible odds with empty magazines and still made the enemy bleed. The full story emerged from debriefs of survivors: the friendly fire catastrophe, transports burning, General Inamura himself blown into the water. The military analysts delivered their verdict: tactical defeat, strategic irrelevance, but something much more important emerged: proof of fighting spirit. At Pearl Harbor, America had been sucker-punched. At Sunda Strait, outnumbered sailors had stood toe-to-toe with the Imperial Navy's best and made them pay in blood. Samuel Eliot Morrison, the Navy's official historian, called it, quote, one of the most gallant fights in American naval annals. More importantly, he noted, it proved American sailors could fight at night, up close, without radar or technological advantages. Just guns, guts, and seamanship. The survivors formed bonds that transcended nationality. 349 Aussies and Yanks who'd survived the water and suffered in camps together. They held reunions where they didn't talk about the war. They didn't need to. Just being in the same room with men who understood was enough. Every year, the reunions grew smaller. Today, memorials stand in Houston and Sydney. The wrecks lie in Indonesian waters, war graves protected by international law. Divers report the ships are remarkably intact, sitting upright, guns still trained outward, defiant. But the real memorial is the lesson of that night. When two battered cruisers met an invasion fleet, they had every reason to run. No one would have blamed them. They were outnumbered 50-1, low on ammunition, exhausted, and facing certain doom. Captain Hector Waller made a different choice: to go through. Waller went down with his ship, hands gripping the rail, watching his guns fall silent. They never found his body, but every naval officer since knows his legacy. When historians ask why the Allies won the Pacific War, they point to production, technology, and code-breaking. All true. But victories are also built on moments when exhausted men choose to fight rather than flee, when impossible odds become irrelevant, when duty matters more than survival.